Today we will speak about the European Union in the international legal order. So it will be a lecture in between European Union law and public international law. And we will set ourselves a set of questions. We will ask three questions. What is the European Union in international law? Can it enjoy rights? Can it assume obligations in international law? The second question will be, what about the external representation of the European Union? Who represents Europe in the world? And the third question will be about the engagement of the European Union in international organizations. In what international organizations does the EU take part? And what is the legal position of the European Union in those international organizations? We will take a special look at the United Nations. First of all, we have to ask ourselves the question, what is the European Union in the international legal order? If anything, the European Union is a very special animal in international law. It is not a state. It is definitely not a nation state. But it is also not a classical intergovernmental organization. The European Union is a regional integration organization with a very extensive measure of international legal personality. That is what is being said also by Article 47 of the Treaty on European Union. The European Union is a very active treaty maker. It has concluded thousands of bilateral and multilateral agreements. Some of the recent treaties include a free trade agreement between the EU and Korea. They include the WTO, the World Trade Organization's agreements. They include an agreement with the so-called ACP countries, the Cotonou Agreement. And of course, right now the European Union is also very actively negotiating new international agreements, such as the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, the TTIP. The second question which we ask ourselves, who represents Europe in the world? By whom is the European Union represented in external affairs, for instance, during treaty negotiations or at important summits with third countries or at international organizations and international conferences? Also, after the Lisbon Treaty, this remains a complicated story. One may recall that Mr. Henry Kissinger once upon a time asked the question, if I want to call Europe, which phone number should I dial? Well, there are still a number of phone numbers that need to be dialed, depending on the level and depending on the substance matter. First of all, there is the function of the High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, which is a function created by the Lisbon Treaty to ensure more unity and continuity in the external representation of the Union. And this person combines the function of High Representative with being one of the Vice Presidents of the European Commission. It is, in other words, a multiple-hatted function. But that is really at the level of Ministers of Foreign Affairs. At the level of the heads of state, Europe is nowadays represented by two persons. There is first of all the permanent president of the European Council, who represents the European Union at head of state level, but for matters of common foreign and security policy. And there is the president of the European Commission, who represents the European Union, also at heads of state and government level, but more for the classical competences of the EU, which we used to call the community competences. And then there are still a variety of other actors. there is still, also after the Lisbon Treaty, a role for the rotating presidency of the Council. Every 6 months, another country chairs the Council, and in certain areas, such as some negotiations in international organizations, this rotating Council presidency still plays a role. And then there is the worldwide diplomatic network of the European Union. The Lisbon Treaty has provided for the creation of the EEAS, the European External Action Service, which is based in Brussels and is a kind of foreign affairs ministry of the European Union, but which also has more than 140 embassies, union delegations all over the world, both in third countries, bilateral delegations, and at international organizations, multilateral delegations, all led by a head of delegation, an EU ambassador. The third question which we look at is the European Union in international organizations. The European Union is a staunch defender of what it calls effective multilateralism. The European Union is very strongly committed to work together with other countries, but also with other global and regional international organizations. The basic treaty of the European Union, the TEU, says even literally in Article 21 that the European Union wants to promote multilateral solutions to common problems, in particular in the framework of the United Nations. There are repeated references in the treaties to working together, in particular with the United Nations. But international organizations are sometimes set up in a way that do not necessarily favor an active engagement of the European Union. Many international organizations only allow nation states to be full members of their organization. So the European Union faces a challenge. It is, legally speaking, a double challenge. There is in the first place the question what the competences are under European Union law for the European Union to be engaged in certain international organizations. That is a matter of EU law. But there is a second dimension to our question, and that is, do the rules of the international organization at hand allow for a full participation by a non-state actor such as the European Union? That is very often a tricky matter. Some international organizations allow for full membership of the European Union. One of the best examples is the World Trade Organization, which was set up in 1995 and counts as full members not just the 28 member states of the European Union, but also the European Union itself. In fact, when you are in a meeting of the WTO in Geneva, you will see that only the EU representative takes the floor and speaks on behalf of the whole European Union. Member states delegates typically do not really speak up there. That is the example of the WTO. There are, however, many other international organizations which restrict their membership to nation states only. This is generally the case for the United Nations and the whole system of United Nations organizations, the UN family. Most of these organizations only allow for full membership by states. And there is only one exception in the whole United Nations system of a specialized agency where the European Union had become a full member. That is the Food and Agriculture Organization based in Rome. Since 1991, the European Union, in those days the European Community, became a so-called member organization. But the FAO is a real exception to the general situation in which the European Union does not fit well within the setup of the United Nations. So what should the EU then do? For many decades, the European Community had become observer in quite a number of United Nations bodies and organizations. For instance, since 1974, the European Economic Community had become an observer in the United Nations General Assembly. In those days, before the Lisbon Treaty took effect, the European Union was represented by the rotating presidency. And the rotating presidency was typically always a member of the international organization in question. So EU statements could simply be delivered by the presidency behind its own nameplate as a member of the United Nations or of a United Nations organization. Since the Lisbon Treaty created permanent positions to represent the European Union, the High Representative, the EU delegations, the President of the European Council, the idea has been that also in the United Nations and in UN agencies, the Union should be represented by one of those permanent actors. But this was very difficult, because if you only have an observer status, you only have very limited participation rights. You typically can only speak up after all the nation states have spoken up, which can take you very, very long if you have an organization like the UN with 193 member states. A solution needed to be found, and in May of 2011, the European Union obtained increased participation rights in the United Nations General Assembly. But only in the General Assembly. The European Union's status within other parts of the United Nations and the United Nations system have not really improved. A particular case is the representation of the European Union in the United Nations Security Council. Article 34, paragraph 2 of the Treaty on European Union has it all laid out. It says that the European Union is in essence represented there by the EU member states that are at that moment members of the Security Council. But if the EU has defined a common position around a certain issue, then those member states are under the obligation to ask the other members of the Security Council to give the floor to the High Representative to present the European Union position. The European Union faces challenges when it wants to engage itself in international organizations. It has higher aspirations than the current situation. However, in trying to upgrade its position in international organizations, the European Union, first of all, needs a strategy. It needs to define priorities for itself. It secondly needs to convince its own member states that they agree on an enhanced position of the EU in a certain international organization. And last but not least, the EU will need to negotiate this better position with the rest of the membership of the international organization at hand. All the three of these conditions have their own challenges.